Hello and welcome to the Bellevue Brief, a podcast from the team at Bellevue Law covering topical workplace law and commercial disputes issues. I'm Florence Brocklesby, the founder of Bellevue Law, and today I'm joined by two of my brilliant colleagues, Ellie Gilbert and Susie Al-Qassab. Today we are discussing, sadly, the very topical issue of redundancy and specifically how employers can approach this difficult situation ethically. Unfortunately, we are seeing a lot of redundancy in our practice on both sides of the table, and perhaps that's not surprising given that the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, in a February 2025 survey found that 25% of employers were considering redundancies. There's no question that redundancy is a very difficult experience for the employees who are impacted, but also for the people managing the process and the people who are left behind afterwards. And how the process is handled can have a huge impact in itself. So our focus today is looking at this through the lens of business ethics, as well as strict legal requirements. For employers considering redundancies, what might an ethical process look like? As I mentioned, we regularly advise both employers and employees on redundancies, and Susie and Ellie advise on both sides of the table. But for the purposes of today's discussion, we've agreed that Susie will focus on the concerns that we commonly hear from employee clients, and Ellie will be looking at things through the perspective of an employer. So Susie and Ellie, what does it mean to run an ethical redundancy process?
I think from the employee's perspective, it's fairly obvious, I suppose, to say that the biggest impact is on the employee and financial consequences, obviously, of losing a job. But also it can be a very emotional experience, I think. I think there's also an impact, and Ellie will talk more about this, on the people left behind, on the business itself and the people who are implementing that redundancy process. But from the employee's perspective, I think what clients often say is that it feels very transactional, when actually for them it's very personal.
I think a common theme that I tend to see is a transparent, fair, ethical process has huge benefits for the business, in terms of the optics for other employees, like you say, who are being left behind, who aren't personally impacted by the redundancy. It affects the culture of the business, and that has a big impact on the organisation as a whole. So I think an ethical, transparent, fair process, as much as an employer can do that, I think has benefits for the business.
It can make the process go more smoothly as well, I suppose, if people feel that they're being treated with respect and perhaps that they're being treated fairly, and if even though the outcome may be unwelcome, but it may be fair, it's probably likely to be a smoother process in my experience, and potentially a shorter process, because people will be less inclined to try to fight, appeal, drag things out as long as possible. They've got nothing to lose if it's entirely transactional and they're getting the bare minimum that they could possibly be entitled to at the end of it.
Yeah, definitely, 100%.
So Susie, where should an employer start if they're contemplating redundancies but trying to do it through an ethical lens?
I mean, it sounds fairly obvious, but start at the beginning. I think a lot of organisations perhaps turn to redundancy too quickly or too easily, and they think of it as, a quick fix, a good quick way to cut costs, but that actually can be quite short-sighted and actually expensive as well. They will have often invested a lot of time and energy in, training up their staff. There's a lot of goodwill and loyalty among existing employees. So I think the first step is to really think about whether redundancies are necessary, and are there other alternatives that they could look at. And like I say, that quite often the skills and the innovation and the goodwill that you lose could be outweighed by more of an effort to either eliminate compulsory redundancies completely, or at least do fewer of them, if that's possible.
We've seen in the last few years in some sectors kind of cycles of redundancies followed by waves of hiring.
Yes,
And then businesses have incurred the disruption and the emotional upheaval, but also the cost of the redundancies. And then they have to incur the costs and the onboarding time frame of recruiting new people who will never have the institutional knowledge of the people who left behind can be unsettling for morale. Other employees recognise that the same thing could happen to them down the line. And if the process has been conducted in quite a transactional way, they will begin to think more transactionally about their own relationship with the employer going forwards as well.
Yep.
So there are some business imperatives as well as ethical imperatives to just think twice before launching into that process in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And it may be often that the business is changing and, ask yourself, can your workforce change with it? And that's a longer term thought process, isn't it? In terms of, if, for example, AI is having an impact on, what, particular roles are doing and the amount of time they need to do it. Well, what skills do those individuals have, and can they be redeployed? Can they be retrained, for other roles in the business?
Yeah, and I think sometimes when you're thinking about costs as well, the time frame that you're thinking about the costs can be quite important. And again, what we see sometimes is like an imperative to make 10% headcount reductions across the business, and that will be looked at from a financial perspective in terms of this financial year. But actually, if you take a slightly longer time frame, which you may or may not have the luxury to do, let's be honest, but if you do take a slightly longer time frame, you may feel that you may find that the maths comes out slightly differently over the longer term.
It's difficult, though, isn't it? If it's an investor-backed business and you only have so much cash left for a particular period of time, and there's a lot of third outside pressures, which dictate redundancies at the moment, particularly when investment is so hard to come by.
And we've certainly seen over the last few years, 2 or 3 years ago, businesses that it wasn't possible to have that conversation, where it wasn't possible to have that conversation about what your alternatives were because they were just coming to the end of their runway.
Yeah.
And that was the stark fact of the matter. And there we're going to talk a little bit about transparent conversations. They're facing a slightly different dilemma than businesses that are thinking about potentially reshaping over time. Something that some employers consider is voluntary redundancies. We don't see it terribly often, do we, Ellie?
No, not in my experience. I think employers often want to have control over who goes and who stays, and they don't want the wrong people to opt to leave. They normally have and this probably goes to the transparency and the lack of any sort of actual, meaningful consultation. They often want to decide in advance of even the process starting who's going to leave via that redundancy process.
Potentially are some advantages to a voluntary process as well as some uncertainty and lack of control for the employer.
Absolutely. I think, at any given time, there are likely to be employees who are, reflecting, thinking about, possibly moving on anyway, or they're at, a stage of their lives where they're looking for a break. So if there's an opportunity for them to leave, as Ellie rightly says, the business is prepared to let them go. And I think that is important that, if you do invite people to volunteer, that you make it crystal clear that it's not an automatic thing that they will definitely be able to leave, but they're putting themselves forward to be considered for it.
And that potentially creates some alignment in terms of allowing people who naturally would have been thinking about leaving or might not have been very invested in continuing to bring their best selves to work for a long period of time, to leave the business amicably, and then reducing the number of people who may need to leave who might not want to do so.
Absolutely.
So assuming that we've done this work and we have concluded that sadly redundancies are going to be required, how would we go about thinking about implementing those redundancies in an ethical manner? I suppose a really key part of that is consultation with the workforce and with the people who are impacted. So let's start by looking at the options that employers have there around consultation.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to say that consultation is not an option in the sense of there's a legal requirement that affected employees are consulted with before final decisions are made. And I think the key descriptor, I suppose, with consultation is that it has to be meaningful. Now, what that means may be slightly different in different circumstances, but what is important is that there's a degree of consultation before decisions are confirmed. So at a kind of formative stage, you might say. And I think that's often where employers fall down in terms of the process and doing things ethically, in that consultation's more of an afterthought, a sham, a tick box exercise, going through the motions, because actually decisions have already been made.
Yeah, I think that what the law requires in terms of consultation and what happens in practice, I think there's quite a big gulf in my experience. And I think it's actually difficult for a lot of employers to comply with that and to consult at a formative stage. I think they've got to weigh up the disruption to the business.
They're often reluctant, aren't they, to consult early because they worry about the impact of doing that on morale within the business, or potentially destabilising quite a wider proportion of the workforce than might otherwise be the case. And then the risk that they run without doing that, of course, is that employees feel that they've not been involved in the process, and as Susie said, that the consultation process that they're then put through is not meaningful, and that the outcome is a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, and that is probably, I think, one of the most common criticisms of redundancy processes from employees, I think, is the lack of a meaningful consultation.
Yeah, and I think also how it is often sprung on them with no warning or notice. It's you're invited to a spurious meeting in your calendar, and it turns out that your manager and HR are sat opposite you, and they kind of drop the bombshell on you. And that kind of shock and distress already means you get off on the wrong foot. Whereas I think, if there's been some engagement at an earlier stage, be that through, a kind of general meeting, town hall, individual conversations, however, a business might go about it, just to start warning people that these conversations are taking place and the reasons for them. On the one hand, it is destabilising, but on the other hand, I think employees appreciate the honesty. They're given some warning. It's fairer in that they can start to think about what their options might be, what might happen, prepare themselves mentally, emotionally, financially. So I think it's a balance.
And it's also perhaps naive to think that just because you didn't consult with your employees, they didn't realise that the business was struggling or that changes were afoot. So what might a more inclusive consultation process look like?
So, as I say, at an earlier stage, involving employees, I think, in the rationale for why they might be required, and that the business isn't going about that lightly, that they have considered alternatives, so transparency. Being clear about what the business case is, and involving employees in those conversations.
And honesty, I think employees, those going and staying, appreciate that, the organisation is there to turn a profit and to run a successful business, and difficult decisions need to be made along the course of that journey. And having the honest conversation with people, explaining what challenges the business faces and is facing, I think people respect that. There's often quite a lot of disagreement regarding selection and why them versus other people. And I think those are the conversations that I think are the most difficult for employers and for employees. I think an area where most employees feel disgruntled is when the writing's clearly on the wall, the process is a sham, the consultation process is a sham, they know the end result, and you have to go through the motions. That to me is not ethical, and maybe legally the employer can tick all the boxes and run a legally compliant process, but to me that's not an ethical process. I've seen examples where employers have been really quite transparent about the likely outcome, and when they do that, they pull the plaster off at a very formative stage, but they offer reasonable settlement packages and redundancy packages as a result, and that obviously softens the blow. And actually, doing it in that way, as long as they're prepared to offer the right level of package, can result in really good employee engagement from those left in the business and those leaving the business.
Yeah, I think there can be a place for that. I think it's probably very specific to the organisation and the nature of the redundancies and even the staff involved. Because on the one hand, it's transparent, but on the other hand, I think employees would probably say that's predetermined, isn't it? So, where's their opportunity to input and to make their representations and make their alternative suggestions, because that is, their right in terms of trying to change the outcome.
But what I would say is, how often do you see those representations altering the outcome of the process? I guess in my experience, it's quite rare for, once an employer has provisionally selected that person as redundant, they've gone through that process of decision making. They've, weighed up the people from whom they could select. And in my experience, that decision doesn't change.
A number of employers manage that with financial terms, which will land in different ways for different people, because some people will be very upset and they haven't necessarily had the opportunity to put forward their own representations in relation to what they might like the outcome to be. And then there are other scenarios where the commercial situation is such that the employees probably recognise that there's no consultation process that can change the outcome because of the situation. I think where you're selecting particular employees for redundancy out of a pool, then there's a different situation from where whole business lines are potentially being closed down. So turning to thinking about how we're selecting employees for redundancies, as opposed to deciding that a certain number of redundancies needs to happen in the first place, what would be an ethical way to approach that?
So again, I think it's a balance, but from a legal perspective, being mindful of meaningful consultation and making sure that happens before decisions are made, then I think employees should be engaged early in that selection process, and employers should be engaging with a wide range of employees, i.e. all of those who may potentially be selected, and consult on criteria, for example, before they can then start to make decisions, and focus down on individual consultations with those who perhaps score the lowest. But there is a tension, I think, between that early consultation and destabilizing potentially a lot of people, and I know employers are not keen often to do that.
So, and the idea that you've just shared there about potentially consulting in relation to how employees are selected, maybe then applying that criteria and then provisionally making selections and consulting individually on the basis of that, potentially in some cases will strike a balance between those sort of two competing needs, so that you're taking input from the employees from the outset, but you're not necessarily creating stress and anxiety for a wider group of people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also perhaps making sure from the employer's perspective that, even though you've made a provisional selection and you're making the choice just to individually consult with those people, you don't, that's not a final decision at that point, in that you're not telling everybody else that they're fine, and they can kind of sit back and relax, because it may be that once you've had those individual consultations on scoring, that actually the scores do need to be reviewed, tweaked, in which case, you need to, I guess, leave the door open to bringing more people into that process if that's appropriate.
And I have seen cases where individual employees have challenged scores, and that has made that difference. And there's always the risk, in particular, that the scores could be tainted, for example, by bias or some form of discrimination as well. When that's flagged, employers are going to need to go back to the drawing board and reconsider, and that may change the outcome as well.
It's also difficult if you've got a manager scoring people who they don't know the person, they haven't worked with them before. So often there can be, it is possible to rescore people and for them to get higher scores in that process.
Yeah, and that goes to the need for proper consultation.
Yeah,
because it's only when the employee gets to give their views on it, it may not change anything, because the factors they raise may be things that have already been taken into consideration or not strictly relevant. But it is surprising how often the input that they have may just change the way that you look at something.
And it's, I think, not just the criteria, but how the scoring is done and how things are measured. And actually, if you can get buy-in to that process, it will make it much smoother. There's agreement to, they'll look at perhaps sales targets, for example, but there'll always be a second step of an overview, by a group of managers, by agreement with the employees. And if the employer sticks to that kind of bargain and goes through that process, harder for the employees, I think, to argue the outcome of that.
And there's a sense of it being still unwelcome, but perhaps recognising the fairness within the process. Exactly.
The business has done everything they can to make it as objective and empirical as possible.
So there's a common theme really that's coming through in this about the kind of ethical, human and legal dilemmas around transparency, because the laws and best practice will probably be encouraging more consultation and more transparency, which has got quite significant advantages in terms of creating fairness and an understanding that the process is fair. It's also potentially unsettling. And I think some of those, I was reflecting some of those laws and processes perhaps created at a time when there was less focus on employee well-being and there was perhaps less prevalence of mental health issues in the workforce. There is a genuine creation of stress and anxiety around these processes, and that balance between doing it thoroughly and doing it relatively swiftly so that people are not stuck in uncertainty for longer than needs to be the case is a difficult balance as well. There's probably no one right answer, and one impacted employee may feel that they want to have more time to consult and more transparency and more information and more opportunity to challenge, and another impacted employee may feel that they want certainty, they just want to know what's going to happen to them.
Yeah, because the more consultation, the longer the overall process and the more uncertainty for everybody, I guess.
Yeah, and it also flags, I guess, the need to think about what kind of support you're going to put in place for your workforce during this time. Most employers are going to have some kind of employee assistance program that some employees will find helpful, maybe making sure that there is some kind of pastoral support for people who are concerned. And one thing that I have noticed when I'm acting for employees is if the process is not properly resourced, that can create additional stress and tension. So if employees have got questions or information that they want to provide or that they want to request, and they're emailing the HR team who are responsible for the process, they don't hear back for a long time because that team's slightly overwhelmed with inquiries and queries and comments from lawyers on settlement agreements. That just adds to the stress and the uncertainty and the unpleasantness of it. So I think a really key thing for employers to do is just to make sure that the process itself is properly resourced.
Yeah, and also planned, a clear plan for the process. FAQs are really common now, even, in individual consultation processes, not just collective consultation processes, and proper information, because...
We always say to employers, plan sooner.
Yeah.
Plan sooner than you think you need to. Because it does take time to get ready to do this and to do it properly.
And a lot of employers take professional PR, internal comms advice now for the rest of the business, how to turn a negative into a positive and, not let it damage the culture that's left behind after people leave.
We've seen really good and really bad examples of internal communications and external communications about redundancy processes.
I think your point about FAQs is a really good one. And also for that to be a kind of living, breathing document approach, as in, particularly when there's a lot of people who are being affected, the same questions will come up, more than once. And I think that sense of kind of sharing information, not just back with that person, but more broadly, across the employee cohort is a really effective way on the one hand to kind of manage the communication, but also employees, therefore, the more information they're getting, the more they feel like they're being consulted with, and they are. The more information they'll have.
So let's turn to another aspect of redundancy process, which is suitable alternative employment. So affected employees have got the right to be given any suitable alternative roles. And what does that look like through an ethical lens?
I think this is probably my biggest bugbear with how employers deal with redundancy processes, in that there's just not enough effort, in my mind, put into this aspect of the process. I think, again, it's a tick box approach. Here's a link to vacancies at the organisation. Here's a list of all current roles that you might want to have a look at. But there's been no thought really given to, well, what might be suitable for this individual. And actually, do I really know what's suitable for this individual? I know what role they've been doing, but actually, what else can they do? What have they done before? What are they interested in? What does their CV look like? Is there something that, might be available with a bit of extra training that they might be able to do? So I think employers basically need to put a bit more effort into it and be more proactive.
Another pitfall for employers is people with extra protection. So people have the right to be offered suitable alternative roles above others in the redundancy exercise. So people who are pregnant, on maternity leave, recently returned from maternity leave, or shared parental leave, they have this special right to be offered roles automatically. And employers, it's amazing actually how many times employers don't know, or they get the right wrong, they misinterpret the right. So that's something to watch out for.
So finally, if the process does result in redundancies, how do employers consider the exit package ethically? When do you introduce the package? Such a wide variety in practice. Some employers, and we see this quite regularly in some sectors, don't run a compliant process at all, or indeed any process. They will terminate somebody's employment with immediate effect, and they will manage the legal risk around that with generally quite a sizable package. Other employers will run an open process and potentially make a without prejudice offer of a settlement terms in parallel with that. And other employers will run the process to its end and then offer a package to those who are ultimately selected for redundancy at the end.
I would say I often see employers choosing a kind of middle path here, where they start the process, put someone at risk, and then at the same time offer them an enhanced redundancy package. Typically, most employers can't afford a hugely generous package, so I guess they have to prepare for and potentially start a legally compliant process. But and most employees would probably want to have a conversation about settlement early on, in my experience, and not go through the rigmarole of a redundancy process if they can avoid it and if the package is okay.
I think that middle way is probably, that probably works for employers and employees, doesn't it? Because there is a shortcut, for both parties if that's the way they want to go. But also it leaves open the option for the employee to go through that formal process, particularly if, they have ideas about, alternatives, or they've got specific proposals they might want to make, around, well, perhaps I could stay on as a consultant, or, have you thought about me doing part-time hours? They might have suggestions, and the consultation process is therefore open to them, to engage with if that's what they want to do, before, kind of resigning themselves, I suppose, to the fact that they're going and therefore looking at the financial side of things.
And I've seen that way of work exactly like that, where a package is offered and that gives the employees the transparency to understand what's likely to happen if the outcome is the end of their employment. And most employees in practice will end up probably just taking that. That process is smoother for them and for the employer. But there might be a minority who have got questions, do want to be consulted, genuinely want to engage in that process with a view to potentially saving their job or moving into a different role. And the door is open for that as well. But those employees who are going to choose to take the package and leave are not put through what they may see as being that sort of charade of having to go to consultation meetings about a job that they don't believe that they're going to keep, or they may not even wish to keep. So it seems to be quite a balanced way and quite a commercial way of managing a process, just giving optionality.
Yeah, and the employee doesn't feel backed into a corner. They have the option, like you say, of going through a compliant process and having, seeing if they can keep their job. And I also think the way the exit package negotiation is handled should really be respectful. It can be robust. The employer will likely have important timescales to keep to and deadlines. But I think the communication and the negotiation discussion of the exit, the redundancy and the package can be done in a respectful way. And I have seen it done in a not so respectful way in some cases. And it doesn't have to be like that. You can have a transparent, open conversation about a potential exit without it being an unpleasant conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I think timing's important too, isn't it? On the one hand, employers have a time frame they're working to, and there needs to be, a deadline, perhaps of some sort. But on the other hand, to put too much time pressure on employees, I think will backfire because they just feel like they've been pushed into a corner and they panic. And I think most employees these days are also aware of the kind of ACAS guidance around the 10 working days, time to consider, an offer if it's put to them. So I think most employers, would at least offer that as a time frame, which I think is reasonable.
So an employer who has run a compliant process is able to offer statutory redundancy pay, which is relatively low amount of money if you're even entitled to it, because an employee with under 2 years service won't be entitled to statutory redundancy pay at all. So the financial package is obviously of quite significant importance to employees who are potentially going to be losing their income for a period of time.
Well, I do think, obviously employers will have financial constraints. So not all employers will be able to offer an enhanced package or a very good enhanced package. But what I would say is that not enhancing the package, it potentially is a bit short-sighted because then you're not, settling and waiving claims. And you can run a legally compliant process, but ultimately redundancy can feel very personal to that employee. And they bring a claim, and that's going to cost you a lot more money than it would have done to settle. Also, management time and disruption and potentially reputational damage. So I do think employers should think about what they can afford, and ultimately, the more generous the package, in my experience, the smoother the process and the speedier the outcome, and which is better for the departing employees and those that stay, and the management dealing with the process and HR. And I think if you can have a transparent, quick, generous process, that is the best and most ethical outcome for everybody.
There's another example maybe of doing the right thing being the thing that's going to be best for the business.
Yeah.
I think as well as kind of generosity, there's a lot to be said for flexibility as well. I think there's nothing worse for employees when they ask for something that it should be relatively reasonable for the employer to give, and the answer is simply no, because that's just not the policy, or we don't normally do that. Actually, the employer should stop and think about that in respect of that particular individual. And a good example might be something like how you deal with their notice. So do that by agreement if you can. Is it better? Does the employee want to be in a job for as long as possible because they think that will maximise their opportunity to find a new job? Can you therefore put them on garden leave so they're still employed? But even if you do that, can you also offer them some flexibility around, an early release if they do find something? So, you're making it more bespoke, you're making it as easy as possible, and you're being as supportive as possible. But actually, at the end of the day, you're not paying any more to that individual. That redundancy is not costing you any more than you might have paid if you just pile on them, because that's your policy.
Yeah. The other area where sometimes we see a bit of flexibility is around post-termination restrictions. So you may have employees who've got restrictions on what they can do when they leave their employment, potentially not being able to work for a competitor, potentially not being able to deal with clients of the current employer. And sometimes we see a little bit of flexibility about that in circumstances where that employee hasn't made the choice to leave the business. And again, that can be done in quite a bespoke way. So sometimes you might see non-compete provisions waived, but non-solicitation provisions remaining in place to protect the business going forwards. And again, it's thinking about the individual's role. Are they likely to find themselves somewhere where there might be mutual clients, and you don't want to be putting them necessarily in a position where they couldn't take that opportunity when it's not a choice that's necessary if they're making in the first place. So I've quite often seen a little bit of flexibility about that in those circumstances. And then really small things, seemingly small things, like potentially letting employees keep their devices. They've just lost their job. They may not have a personal laptop and yet they're going out to look for a new role. And I'm surprised how often that's something that employees either ask for or are very grateful to be offered as well. Yep. And that, in circumstances where often the employer isn't going to take that device back and use it in any meaningful way. So it's quite a practical thing. And then the other thing that people often ask about is medical insurance. If you have medical insurance and you are undergoing treatment or someone in your family is undergoing treatment, thinking about what the options around that might be as well can be very, very meaningful and can remove quite a large amount of stress, an extra layer of stress for somebody perhaps at a difficult time.
Yep.
And then in terms of the settlement agreements and which employees have to sign to get the enhanced redundancy package, a real bugbear of mine is just overly lengthy, complicated belt and braces, bells and whistles agreements for junior employees. I think a lot of employers and law firms will issue, unnecessarily detailed and lengthy agreements, and they don't think about the risk and what they're actually seeking to gain from this agreement. And that causes, I think, it makes the employees feel potentially more intimidated, causes them to have to take more legal advice, and makes the whole process a little bit more, I guess, intimidating, overwhelming than it needs to be.
And I would say in relation to settlement agreements, we see very low contributions towards legal fees for the employee's legal advisor. And that makes it hard for the employee to get meaningful legal advice. And sometimes it makes it hard for the employee to get legal advice at all. Because if the contribution is too low, then the pool of lawyers who'll be willing to give advice is a lot smaller, and that causes stress if you're trying to get the package finalised, and it's difficult to get the advice on it. Then that's an extra layer of stress for the.
You have to ring around 10 law firms to find someone who's going to do it for that cost.
I think it can be quite a frustrating process as well for employees if they're given this kind of lengthy tome and they manage to get advice on it, and there are then some things that they want to change and they're simply told computer says no. It's just a very frustrating, unnecessary process that leaves a bad taste, I think, in their mouth. And I think in an ideal world, businesses would want to leave on good terms, or as good terms as you can, even in a redundancy situation, because you never know when paths might cross again. And just because someone's leaving the business doesn't mean they are leaving their colleagues forever. And people talk about how things are done, and good PR, even in when you're going through those types of processes, is very valuable.
I also think actually just issue the employee with a really straightforward, simple settlement agreement and reasonably worded on both sides, and stop all the back and forth. And then the employees can just sign, and you don't have to have lots of toing and froing about the amendments and the wording and the drafting. There's no reason why an agreement can't be reasonably worded at the outset.
And again, that goes to the resources as well, because you then as the employer are not going to have to spend a lot of time with a lot of individual employees coming backwards and forwards looking for amendments to the agreement that you potentially could have just conceded in the first place because they're not very significant.
Or paying lawyers' fees, legal fees on that as well. And something I've seen from some quite big employers actually as mandating which law firms that the employee has to instruct for them to pay the contribution. And they haven't backed down in my experience. I know that I think a few of our colleagues in the team have had the same experience, and that's really surprising.
Yeah. I mean, for me, that undermines the concept of freedom of choice and getting independent advice. If you're being effectively told you have to use those lawyers because that's the only way we'll pay for it.
And that's not an ethical, I don't think, approach to it at all. It does leave a bad taste in the mouth of that departing employee.
And while those lawyers will have duties to their clients directly, it does make it harder for the client to trust the lawyer.
Exactly, yeah.
Through no fault of the lawyers. The lawyers got duties to their client to act in their best interests at all time. But whether the employee will be confident that will be the case when their employer has told them that they have to use that particular lawyer is a separate matter.
I feel like we could do a whole podcast
Yes.
on instructing lawyers for settlement agreements.
Well, let's not do that tonight.
Yeah.
Thinking about non-financial support that employers could offer, then references is often an important area for employees looking to find another job. I think there's a general approach now that's adopted by most companies, which is simply to provide the factual reference. And obviously that's important. But, where employees, they're not being dismissed for misconduct or for poor performance, employers, I think, should try a bit harder to see if they can provide something more detailed, more helpful to employees, which, they can do without any real legal risk around doing that, but it's extremely helpful for the employee,
and yet vanishingly rare.
Absolutely, very, very rare. And then outplacement is the other thing. Now that can come in lots of different guises, but help optimizing a CV, writing a CV. I mean, they may have been at their company for a long time, and they wouldn't. It's very much a standing start for them to look for something else. So, help with CV writing, interview practice, interview coaching, things like that can be really valuable, but actually not cost the employer very much.
The clients I've acted for have actually had a lot of positive things to say about outplacement services. So I think people are quite quick to dismiss it as unnecessary, but I think it can be really, really helpful, especially in a really tough employment market.
Great. Well, look, Ellie and Susie, thank you so much for all of those insights. They're really helpful. That brings us to the end of this episode and to the end of season 1 of the Bellevue Brief. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll be back with season 2 soon.